Hello, everybody. It is Saturday night at 10 p.m. Eastern Time. One more time in English. I'm Chris Weave, and this is Starfleet Tactical. I don't have Alec with me yet because Alec is not feeling well. And so he may or may not be joining me. He said something about jumping in the shower and seeing if that will cause him to rally. This was sort of a sudden onset thing. So I'm just going to proceed as if he's not going to make it. And we'll see if he does. And if he does, we'll have a conversation and we'll talk about various stuff that's been going on. And if he doesn't make it, then he doesn't make it. So let's see, what else was I going to say? Oh, LYSSA is out sick tonight as well. She's had some horrible cold thing that just hasn't gone away. And so that's why she's missed the last couple of times. So it's looking like it might just be me tonight. But I'm prepared to talk about the stuff I was going to talk about, which was listed as being battleships. In retrospect, I probably should have said battleship museums, because that's really what I'm talking about. I'm talking about battleship museums. But as we do on this show, I'm going to spend a bunch of time talking about the real world, and I'm going to spend a bunch of time talking about science fiction. And in particular, I'm going to work some Star Trek in there. So let me go ahead and start. There's a very interesting conversation taking place in the chat on the Aries Studio side of things. I'm sorry to hear that Rob Davidoff slipped on the ice and dislocated his elbow, which, oh my God, that sounds painful. But I hope he's doing okay. And I hope everybody else is doing okay too. Let's see. Wright points out, being that all surviving battleships are museums now, it's still technically true. Yeah, the thing is, I wouldn't want somebody to come and think I was going to talk about historical battleship combat, etc., when I'm really sort of focused on the museum ships and what you can see in them. So let me go ahead and start this up. And let's start off with the changes to my schedule. So you'll note there's a whole bunch of stuff in February that used to be I'm not available. I decided to cancel that trip. That trip was gonna be a long one. That trip was gonna involve actually it was going to start off down in Wright's neck of the woods, going down to the Florida Panhandle. That was a late addition to it. And then I was going to go to DC, and I was going to go to Charlottesville, and I was going to do this, and I was going to do that. And it was going to be a 3-week-long trip. And I just decided I don't have a 3-week-long trip in me. So I'm canceling that trip. I'm still going to miss a couple of days in March. I've extended this out. There's 2 weekends in March. Part of the reason I decided I don't have a 3-week-long trip in me in February is I know I've got a 10-day long trip that's going to take place in March that I have to do. And so I'm going to do the March trip. So by and large, I'm going to be here pretty much steady between now and the end of March, with the exception of sort of the 9th and the 16th of March. Let's see. I think all the images, usually I've got this little caveat that says, here to add educational value through criticism and commentary of the images. But I think all the images tonight, the images tonight come from 2 sources. One of them is me and me taking pictures. And one of them is Wright Sublette, because Wright's got some pictures of the USS Texas, and I'm going to use them. And I didn't even ask him. I just decided I was going to do that. So thank you, Wright, for not suing me. Okay, so first odds and ends or 2, then I'm going to talk about battleship museums. I'm actually going to do the pictures sort of in with the battleship museums. Okay, so Wilhelm's got a quick question. Let me dump it up here real quick. Do I think a Star Trek style Star Blazer battleship could be in a Star Trek setting? Well, we kind of saw that. That wasn't that the Doomsday Machine, sort of, kind of. I mean, it's got the BFG. It's got that's kind of a wave motion gun. I don't know. I mean, I always get really, really. This is a good question because it allows me to highlight something that I've said before on this show, but I haven't said recently, which is I generally don't try to do comparisons between genres in terms, I certainly don't in terms of like, would this ship beat that ship? Because the technological assumptions are so disparate. They all, in order for the science fiction part to work, everybody sort of assumes a liberal dose of hand wavium over certain laws of physics or whatever. They've all got gizmos that make it all work. There's a MacGuffin. They've all got MacGuffins in there that make it all work. And the MacGuffins are all different. On top of that, you run into the problem where some of them just are problematic because they they don't really approach the problem that way, right? Like I don't try to analyze Star Wars because I think Star Wars just doesn't make sense in and of itself. They just make stuff up and add it on. And some people have said no, if you read like the Star Wars technical commentaries and stuff, there actually is a core of consistency there, but by and large I just don't see it. And so I just don't even try to do that level of analysis on things like that. When it comes to the other things, it's like, okay, so like these guys have a jump drive and these guys got a warp drive and their shield technology is different, and these guys have shields and these guys don't, and you sort of it very quickly gets to the point where the physics works different in the different universes, and it's just hard you're comparing apples and oranges. So I just decide not to do it. Okay, so next slide. So odds and ends. The big odds and end is, so you may recall that originally I wasn't going to do a show last week because I was going to be at a science fiction convention. And then I said in the episode before last week, so I said it for the January 6th episode, that, hey, wait a minute, I'm going to do a show after all. It's going to be at the con, MarsCon in Virginia Beach, Virginia. It's going to be at the con. It's not going to be listed, but here's the link. And I gave you guys the link. And I also said it's going to be part of the Armchair Dragoons digital convention. Brant Guillory, the leader of the Armchair Dragoons, asked me to do a show. And so I said, okay, for you, I will. And I said at the time, it may or may not work because who knows whether the hotel has a good internet connection. And we made it work. And I had Jacob Holo, and who's writing with David Weber now and is the heir apparent to taking over the Honorverse. Tom Pope was there. Tom has written a bunch of stuff with David Weber and Timothy Zahn and stuff like that. Tom's sort of the lead continuity guy in the Honorverse these days. And, I was part of that team. I'm basically, there's a group of us that sort of de facto support Tom now. And so I'm part of that team. And Peter Gold, who's been on the show previously when we talked about merchant marine and container ships and stuff like that, we all got on the show and did it from our hotel room, and it seemed to work out okay. Well, I've made that link available. So if you go, and this is it's in the description for this week's show, and the link is in last week, 2 weeks ago, the January 6th show. If you go to either of those, you can, the description part of on YouTube, you can get to this special show we did. And it talks about, I'm going to talk about some of the stuff again tonight, which is we did a tour of the USS Wisconsin. And so some of that's going to show up tonight. Okay, so next let's talk about battleship museums. So I was talking with Alec earlier today, or maybe yesterday, actually. I think it was yesterday. He gave me a call. And so I had talked about how I had been to a bunch of battleships and which ones he had been to, et cetera. And we decided to just go through the list of them and talk about what they have and what they don't. And so I've been to a bunch of these, and some of these I remember what you have access to, and some of them I don't quite remember. And in one case, I talked with my brother Delon, who's been there. So what I'm going to do is go through each of these museum ships and sort of tell you what's available and provide some additional commentary on it. Jens makes the comment, the year he leaves, I show up at MarsCon. Yeah, I used to go to MarsCon all the time. I haven't been recently, in part because it's just has conflicted with other things, but I used to go all the time. So, okay, so let's go through these ships. So the first one is the USS Alabama. It's in Battleship Memorial Park in Mobile Bay, Alabama. And I toured this ship with Wright Sublette and a friend of his whose name escapes me off the top of my head. I've got it written down somewhere, but I can't remember off the top of my head. The Alabama is a South Dakota class battleship, which was the class right before the Iowa class. So it's the second most modern class of U.S. battleships. They were built starting in 1939 through 1942. There were 4 of them, and you can see the stats there. All those stats come straight out of Wikipedia. So that's just a straight Wikipedia thing. You know what? Let me turn off the banner. I think you guys all understand that I don't speak for my employer. My employer doesn't speak for me, so I don't have to have that banner running. And I certainly didn't count on that banner being there when I put together the slides. So if you go to this, what can you see? And I've got a list here. I'm going to give this list for all of them of the stuff that I think is easy. So first, can you see the bridge? Now, I have yet to see a battleship where you can actually go into the conning tower, which is the armored citadel inside the superstructure. But there, you can usually go, or frequently you can go in the bridge, which goes outside the conning tower, and you can look into the conning tower because the conning tower frequently has big windows with a window cover that comes up and covers the vision slit. It's a vision slit, and sometimes, like in the case of the Wisconsin, the door that allows you to get in, it's like a 3,000 pound door. It lets you get into the conning tower. It was open. But you can't usually go inside, and it's really kind of cramped in there anyway. So you can generally see the bridge. I can't remember if you could do that in the Alabama. In fact, I don't think that we even tried. Yeah, so Wright says that you can view the bridge wings and you can look into the armored portion, which is good. So you can see the magazine in the lower turret. Now, if I'd been thinking, I would have put an illustration of a turret up there. The important thing to understand about the turret of a battleship, and this has some interesting implications, not for Star Trek, but for other types of science fiction that have turrets like that. The turret, the part that you see that has the guns in it, is the penthouse on a 4 or 5 story building. Because that turret goes pretty damn deep into the ship. Not all the way to the bottom, but pretty close. And at the bottom, you've got the magazine, and that entire structure, that entire like 4-story tall structure rotates around. And you move from the non-rotating part of the ship onto the rotating part, and you've got access as it's rotating around. So it's all open. It's not, you can sort of, if you wanted to, you could have 1 foot on the rotating section and 1 foot on the non-rotating section. But that's how you get stuff from the magazine. You have to move it over onto the rotating section. And so I think that the magazine in the lower turret area is in some ways one of the 2 most interesting parts of the ship, the other one being gunnery plot. And so in the Alabama, you can see all that stuff. They've cut away the armor and put up a grate so you can look in and see that stuff. In some ships, you can get in and sort of get down there, and other ships you can't. And you can look down. You can look down and you can see everything there. I can't remember if this is the ship where you can get in there or not. One of the ships you can get in the bottom area, and the other one you can just look. And I think that actually Alabama's the one where you can get in the bottom of the turret, and Massachusetts, you can sort of do the upper section of it, but you can only look into the lower part. Can you see the Combat Information Center? To be honest, I can't remember if you can go and stick your head in the Combat Information Center. Frequently, that's plexiglassed off, so you can look inside, but you can't actually go inside. I just simply don't remember for this one. Can you get into gunnery plotting? I can't remember if you can get into gunnery plotting or you can just look into it or whatever. I can't remember that as well. Now, Jens and some of the other ones are actually putting some comments in here. So if you look in the comments, I think they're in the Aries Studio channel. If you look in the comments, you can see other people commenting on things, people that are more familiar with the ship than I am, about what you can get into and what you can't. For instance, we're going to talk about North Carolina, but he's talking about the North Carolina there. Okay, so living spaces, yeah, you can get into living spaces, and we went down into engineering. You can get into engineering. In fact, I think we had a little tour of engineering, if I remember correctly. So this is a ship that was, the entire class of ships was decommissioned shortly after the war, 1947. So there was limited or no post-war refit. Take all the armament for the secondary guns with a grain of salt, because they're constantly adding stuff on, and they were putting, there's refits all the time, etc. The older a ship is, the more inaccurate those things are likely to be, because they constantly changed all that stuff during the war. If you go down to the Alabama at Battleship Memorial Park, they also have a World War II submarine, the USS Drum. There's an air museum that has a bunch of airplanes, including an A-12, which is the single-seat Blackbird variant that was flown by the CIA, and they have one of the engines pulled out so you can see what that engine looks like, which is pretty damn cool. And they also have a YF-17, which was the test bed for, it was the prototype for the F-18 Hornet. They've got the original prototype down there, and I was looking at it going like, that looks like a Hornet, but there's some weirdnesses to it, and it turns out it's because it was actually not an F-18, it was the YF-17. Okay. So the Iowa is an Iowa-class battleship, which was the next class after the South Dakota. There were 4 of these built as well. The Iowa itself is at the USS Iowa Museum in the port of Los Angeles, California. It is the only Iowa-class battleship that I have not laid eyes on. When it used to be in Newport, Rhode Island at Naval Station Newport, they moved it about 6 months before the very first time I went to Naval Station Newport. They moved it to California, and so I still haven't laid eyes on it, although my brother DeLon has laid eyes on it, and so I asked him some questions about it. So what can you see on the Iowa? You can see the bridge. They went on the bridge, and he can't remember if you can get into the magazine in the lower turret. Can't remember if you could get into the upper turret. I think he said that he seemed to think that you could stick your head up at least and look in it, but he couldn't remember if you can climb in the turret. He thinks you could get into the Combat Information Center. And I didn't specifically ask about the Combat Engagement Center. So that's an interesting question. What's the difference between a CIC and a CEC? Well, Combat Engagement Center was something that, to the best of my knowledge, was limited to the Iowa-class battleships. So you had the original Combat Information Center, which was buried down in the ship. It's very close to gunnery plot. And Combat Information Center was about the World War II era equipment. It was about firing the big guns. Now, when it came time for them to bring these battleships back during the Reagan administration, the question was, how do we upgrade them? And where do we put the upgrade stuff? How do you control the upgrade stuff? They wanted to add CWIS, the close-in weapon system, the phalanx that looks like R2-D2. They wanted to add a Slick 32 electronic warfare system and some other stuff that goes along with it. They wanted to add Tomahawk cruise missiles, land attack cruise missiles, and Harpoon anti-ship missiles. And so there wasn't any room in CIC to put this stuff. There just wasn't room there. So where are they going to put it? Well, they decided that the place to put it was the Admiral's stateroom. And so on all of these ships, they converted the Admiral's stateroom into something called the Combat Engagement Center. And so the Admiral's stateroom is up on the deck. Basically on the New Jersey, at least, it's got a hatch that leads to the outside. You can walk out on deck from inside the Combat Engagement Center. That is not the case on the Wisconsin. And I don't know about the other 2 ships. And so, okay, so where does the Admiral sleep? Well, first of all, none of these ships during during the Reagan administration deployed with an admiral. So they just didn't. But they wanted to have a capability to have an admiral on board. So what they did is there was some officers' territory, some visiting officers' quarters that they basically ripped out some bulkheads and turned it into an admiral's stateroom with a separate living area and a living room, dining room area with a table. And like the CO of the Wisconsin, he'd do captain's masts in there so that his stateroom with his table and all that stuff. That was a time for, work and joyous stuff. The unpleasantness of captain's mass he'd do in the admiral stateroom. But no admirals ever went to sea on these ships after the refit, although they did have admirals on board during World War II. For instance, Halsey was on board New Jersey. That was his flagship at one point. So Combat Engagement Center controls all the new stuff that they had on board, and it's located in one location. Combat Information Center controlled all the big guns, the World War II era stuff, and that was down in the basement. So gunnery plot, Delon couldn't remember if you can see gunnery plot. I'm going to have some pictures of gunnery plot, some of the stuff that's in gunnery plot on the Wisconsin. Living spaces, you can see the living spaces on the Iowa, and you can see engineering. Now, all the Iowas had extensive post-war refits. They had multiple post-war refits because they came back for Korea, they came back for Vietnam, at least the New Jersey did, and they came back for the Reagan era. Delon also said that you can have dinner in the captain's quarters, that he had dinner in the captain's quarters of the Iowa class when he went out and visited it. So, okay. The USS Massachusetts is a South Dakota class battleship located in Battleship Cove, Fall River, Massachusetts. That's a nifty little museum there. They've got PT boats. They've got all sorts of other stuff. A World War II submarine, a World War II destroyer that had a 1960s era refit. And they used to have the Tarantal class guided missile corvette, the Hidden Sea that they got from the East German Navy. But I heard that they had scrapped that for some reason. It was still there the last time I was there, but I heard that they were closing it and they're getting rid of it. And I don't know what the story is on that. So what can you see there? I think you can see the bridge. I couldn't remember because to be honest, the bridge is really kind of boring. It's just a platform with some windows. The bridge itself is kind of boring. There's not a whole lot to see. So the last time I was there, which was back in September, I didn't even try to do that. You can get in to see the magazine, the lower turret, and see all that stuff down there. You can get in the upper turret. You can see CIC, but it's behind plexiglass. You can see gunnery plot. It's also behind plexiglass. They basically took out a wall, and you can just look inside and see what's in there. And you can see living spaces and engineering. And this ship, of all the ships that I've been to, this is the one that you're able to sort of do the most walking around yourself. I've done a tour on it, but by and large, most of the time I've spent on this ship, it's been a self-guided tour. There was virtually no post-war refit because this ship went out of commission in the late 1940s. They didn't keep this one around. Okay, the Missouri I is in Pearl Harbor, not Pearl Harbor, as I wrote, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. And I don't know what you can see there. When the last time I laid eyes on it at Pearl Harbor was 2003, I think. It might have been 2000. Yeah, it's like 2002. I saw it coming in on I probably saw it in 2003 and 2004. In 2002, I saw it coming in. I was on the USS O'Kane, and we sailed by it. At that point, you couldn't get to anything. You could just go on deck, and it cost you $20 to go on the deck, and you couldn't see anything else. And while I have absolutely no problem of donating $20 to a museum ship because, they were going to open this stuff, they needed money to open up the rest of the ship. I ended up going to another museum instead because there was a submarine museum. I only had time to do one or the other. It's like I can walk on the deck of the battleship or I can actually go see the submarine museum. So I went for the submarine museum. It, like all the other Iowa classes, had an extensive post-war refit. And so that's what we ended up seeing there. That's what they ended up having. I don't know what you can currently see there. Okay, so the New Jersey, I've been on the New Jersey. It's in the Camden waterfront in Camden, New Jersey. It's basically across from the Olympia for some value of across. I seem to recall you can see the bridge. I can't remember if you can do the lower turret in the magazine. You can get inside the upper turret. I've done that. I think you could see CIC, but I don't remember. And you can indeed see CEC as part of a tour. And there was also an engineering tour, if I remember correctly. I don't recall about gunnery plot. I think you could see the living spaces. So I don't have a whole lot of memory of this. The one thing I do remember was that it was hard to get to. I was there with my friends Arias Kaufman and Walter Hunt, and Walter Hunt's editor at the time, whose name escapes me. And we could see the ship, and we're driving around going like, we can see it. It's right there. We can see, I mean, it's looming over us, and we couldn't figure out where the parking was for this ship. So that was in the days before GPS. So hopefully it's easier to find now than it was then. So the next ship on the list is USS Texas, which is easily the oldest ship on this list. It is a New York class battleship. They made 2 of these. It's what's known as a standard battleship. Now, they also called these super dreadnoughts because you had the World War I dreadnoughts, and these were the later ones that were super dreadnoughts. That terminology had really sort of fallen by the wayside by the time World War II rolled around. But they did refer to it as a standard battleship because the U.S. had a particular battleship template that it used. They were all approximately the same speed with approximately the same armament. They had pretty much the same turning radius. And as a result, you didn't have the problem of dissimilar characteristics. And that's a problem that the Brits, for instance, ran into, is that their ships were, they had different ships and they had different capabilities, and making them all fly in formation could sometimes be difficult. We built to a standard template. And if you remember what I said about Harris Lanning back when I was doing Harris Lanning and Trent Hone and Karl Lautenschlager, Harris Lanning talks about what you do with when you've got a slow battle line, right? And Trent Hone was talking about what you do when you got a slow battle line. Hone more than Lanning, actually. Because these ships were relatively slow. We decided to standardize on armament and armor as being more important than speed. And as a result, these were slow battleships. Now, when World War II came about, we built the North Carolina class, and we built the South Dakota class, and we built the Iowa class, and they were faster battleships. So the South Dakotas were 27 knots. The North Carolinas were a little bit faster. The Iowas were 33 plus knots. And so the idea is that in a battle group situation or a battle line situation, that these would form the fast wing. Because you may recall that when I talked about Trent Hone, we were planning on fighting on a reverse course, because the entire rest of the world was planning on fighting on parallel courses, with the idea that your fast, powerful forces up front would try to cut off the other guy's line, right? You're wanting to cap his T, and so there'd be this race between the fast, powerful forces at the front to see who could cut the other guy off. We didn't have any fast, powerful forces. Our fast forces weren't powerful. Our powerful forces weren't fast. And the end result of that was that we ended up coming up with an entirely different set of tactics to deal with that. The Iowa class and the other fast battleships sort of solved that problem of fast, powerful forces. We finally had them. And one of the things I need to do is I need to pull the thread on Trent Hone's later work to see how did the introduction of the fast battleships change those tactics. I don't have a good feel for that. Okay, I've never seen the USS Texas. She's currently in dry dock. The one thing I can't remember where she was. I didn't put that down because she was somewhere in Galveston, if I remember correctly, because she's not going back there. They're going to move her someplace else. And I don't think they fully determined yet. They've ruled out a couple of cities, and they've sort of said it's going to be in this location, but there's various proposals, and they haven't actually done anything with it yet. I don't know what you can see. Right now, you can't really see anything because she's in dry dock. And this was an old ship when World War II came around. She was built in the two North New York classes were built in 1911, 1914, that time frame, was refit for the war, fought in World War II, but immediately decommissioned after the war. So let's take a look at a couple of pictures here. Here we've got pictures in dry dock. These were taken by Wright Sublette. So thank you, Wright, for doing that. Wilhelm asked the question real quick: did any of the World War I battleships see service in World War II? Yes. I mean, the Texas counts. Texas, I can't remember what battle she was in, but she saw service in World War II. And the Japanese had some ships that weren't necessarily battleships in World War I. They were battle cruisers, but they armored them and turned them into battleships for World War II. So I don't have a complete list of how many ships fit in that category. But there's at least some. Basically, the older ships in our battle line were built for World War I. So that's a picture of Wright standing underneath. You can see the battleship. You can see the blocks there. And I don't. Somebody, Jen said that they were doing tours in the dry dock. Could be. I have no reason to doubt him. Let me put it that way. I just wasn't aware of. I don't know what you can see. I think most of what they're doing in dry dock is external hull stuff. There was holes in the hull. Now there were leaks in the ship. The ship has torpedo bulges, and the outside of the torpedo bulges, right outside the people tank, was really sort of problematic. I may or may not have a picture of that. There's one or two that he took, but I trying to remember. Did it? Nope, I didn't put any other ones. So this is what I've got. So that's what she currently looks like. I need to get down and see this ship when they have a home port for her again, and she's a museum again. Okay, the Wisconsin, last battleship on the list. So the Wisconsin is I didn't change the location. Sorry. She's in Norfolk, Virginia. She's in downtown Norfolk, Virginia, like right in the middle of where there's a convention center type hotel, like right down the street. In fact, I didn't realize exactly how. I knew I was close. I didn't realize how close until I went to drive out of the parking garage, and I turned the left to see if there was any traffic coming, and literally there was a battleship facing me half a block away. I had not realized that I was quite that close. But she's in Norfolk, Virginia. She's attached to the Nauticus Museum in Norfolk. Nauticus is currently closed, but there's actually 3 facilities there. There's the Wisconsin. There's a naval museum that's on the 3rd floor of Nauticus, 2nd or 3rd floor, and it's open. Nauticus itself is closed for refurbishment, but you can still see the Wisconsin. So, I didn't finish this because the bridge, you can get onto the bridge as part of a tour. You couldn't get into the lower turret or the magazine. You could get into the upper turret. As part of the tour, you could get into CEC. We didn't try to track down CIC, and you can get in the gunnery plot. I really got distracted on this slide. You can get in the gunnery plot. I'm going to have pictures from that in just a second. You can do a tour of the living spaces. I think we got a tour of the living spaces, but it was sort of a special deal. But I think you can normally get a tour of some of the living spaces. And you can do a tour of engineering. And so the group of us went and did this tour, wandered around the ship. The tour guide liked us. We liked the tour guide. At one point, we were just waiting for the next tour to start. We had come back early from lunch. We were going to go look at the lower turret, discovered you couldn't get into the lower turret. So we're just sitting in the wardroom, twiddling our thumbs. Doug, our tour guide, comes up and says, "Hey, do you want a tour of the living spaces?" Well, we're waiting for the other tour. It's like, sure. So we went and did a tour of the living spaces, and that was kind of cool. So Doug and the other docents there are just fantastic. They're really good. Now, I made the comment here about air quality issues. Parts of the ship we couldn't get access to. Like, that's one of the reasons why some of the turret areas were closed off and part of Broadway was closed off. The city in Norfolk like runs the museum somehow. I don't know what the total arrangement is, but it works out in such a way that the city of Norfolk has sort of administrative jurisdiction over the ship. And they have declared the ship to be a building. And it has to meet building air quality standards. And the problem is they did air quality tests, and there are parts of the ship where all the solvents and the paint, et cetera, you can smell them. In fact, I told the people we were with, because I thought we could get into the lower turret. If you can get into the lower turret area of a ship, you should probably bring a separate set of clothes that you then put in a plastic bag when you're done. Don't count on being able to wear those clothes the rest of the trip, because ships have a smell about them. And in the case of Wisconsin, most of the areas that have that smell that has a tendency to sort of cling to your clothes, we weren't allowed into for air quality reasons. Now, yeah, Jens points out ventilation is an issue. It definitely is an issue. And people would say, on the one hand, people are like, well, I can't believe they won't let us in here. To which my response is, look, there's a reason why there's air quality stuff, right? It's not like they're just trying to screw with you. They think there's a problem with the air. I'm okay with somebody who's a specialist testing the air and saying, you should probably not be breathing this air. I'm okay with that. So the end result was we couldn't go down Broadway, which is a corridor that both the South Dakota class has and the Massachusetts has, and the South Dakotas and the Iowas have a corridor called Broadway, which runs 300 meters. I mean, it's 200 meters, 600 feet, something like that. It's huge, and it runs a good length of the ship. It's got a monorail along the top where you can move shells down and big heavy gear, etc. It's above the water line. That's the only way you can have an open space like that, and you can just sort of like look down the ship. And they had part of Broadway closed, and I just realized I forgot the North Carolina. I was going to do the North Carolina too, even though that I've never actually been on that ship. I don't have anything to say about the North Carolina because I haven't been on that ship. I don't know what's available and what isn't, but I was at least going to point out that the North Carolina is in Charlotte, North Carolina. So, like I said, I got distracted while doing this presentation and didn't get back to it. Wright points out that North Carolina should have a Broadway as well. That totally and completely makes sense to me. I think that was sort of standard. You need it to move big gear like that around, and all that is above the watertight levels. So you've got something on a warship called the damage control deck. At least U.S. standards are there's a damage control deck. Below the damage control deck, to get from one watertight compartment to another watertight compartment, you have to go up through the ceiling, over, and then back down again. Now, you don't have anything like that in a starship, right? You certainly don't see anything like that in Star Trek. The closest I can think of is that in Strange New Worlds, he wanted people at one point, they were in a gas giant, and he wanted people to evacuate from the secondary hull because there was some thought that maybe the secondary hull had big open spaces, and as a result, if they had a leak or some problem, that could be more problematic. That's at least what we think was going on there. That's the closest thing I can think of. But it's interesting when you sort of look at things like the damage control deck and how those things fit in. I always look at that stuff and go, okay, so what's the Starship equivalent of the damage control deck? Is there one? Or, the thing is that long corridor is very useful, right? It's the primary way to get from one end of the ship to the other end. It's if you need to move shells from one armory to another armory, from one magazine to another magazine, you lift them up to that deck, you move them along the monorail, and you move them down again. All the heavy gear in the ship that can be removed while at sea is designed so that it's got easy access to that monorail. So like the monorail will come around and you'll see a big hatch in the floor, and there's a place for there to be a winch that will allow you to go down and grab the thing and pull it up to that level and connect it to the main monorail and move it to the machine shop where it has to go to be processed. What's the equivalent of that in a Starship? Is there an equivalent of that in a Starship? I think the answer is yes and no. It may not be called the damage control deck, and it may serve another purpose. But the important thing here is that because of the environment in which this ship operates, there's a certain set of standards that define what you need to do when you're doing ship design. And I think this would apply as well as in a Starship. So back to the subject of the smell of ships. My brother said that the Iowa made his clothes smell, made his family's clothes smell. That doesn't surprise me. Let's see. Oh, the North Carolina is in Wilmington. Like I said, I'm really sorry that I screwed up that part of the presentation. I totally forgot to include the North Carolina. So, okay, so let's see next. So let's take a look at a few pictures of the that came from the inside of the Wisconsin. So on the left, we have some graffiti that I'm told this graffiti is all over the ship, that somebody drew this. This is what's known as the cow god. It's Wisconsin, right? Cows, dairy. That's the cow god. And that apparently you can find this all over the ship. This was in a stairwell, ladder well. It was sort of up high. I mean, I couldn't reach it. So whoever did it had to stand on a ladder to do it. And I think this is the one that they said was right around the corner from where the XO stateroom was. And so whoever put that thing in, the XO was right around the corner. At least his stateroom was. And so apparently this graffiti's all over. I'll admit I was kind of keeping my eyes open for it. I didn't see it anyplace else, but that's what the docent told us. On the right-hand side, what we see is a bank of switches. Now, when you go into gunnery plot, there are just walls of these switches, right? Like one entire wall is different banks of switches. And what you're looking at here is basically the ability to reconfigure all the circuits in the ship. So you've got spot 1 and spot 2 that generally control the big guns. And by control, I mean they control firing, they control aiming, the whole bit like that. They control the big guns. You've got Sky 1 through 4 that control the smaller guns in general, and they're sort of organized in sectors. You may recall from the when I was talking about doctrine back in the Trent Hone, I put up a little thing that talked about how standard doctrine is to divide the area around the ship into 400-degree segments. So there's an overlap with your mate on either side. You divide it into 400-degree segments. You would assign one of those to Sky 1 and one to Sky 2 and one to Sky 3 and one to Sky 4, and that's how you do it. But what happens if spot 1 is down and spot 1 is sort of forward, spot 2 is aft. If spot 1 is down and spot 2 doesn't have a view on it, what do? Well, you say Sky 1 is now going to control the guns. Well, how does it control the guns? The answer is somebody goes into this room and starts turning these handles, and all these handles are like, they're set up with the various components. Like one is the directors, like Sky 1, Spot 1, et cetera, and what they control. And, there's one for guns, there's one for various computers, like gunnery computers, et cetera. And by setting these switches to certain combinations, you can have Spot 1 and Spot 2, Sky 1 through 4, gunnery plot 1, gunnery plot 2. There's a forward one and an after one in these ships, and they basically, usually the forward one controls the main guns, and the after one controls the 5-inch batteries, and the various guns. You can set it up so that any possible combination of these things can be wired up. Now, there's some things you wouldn't do, because it wouldn't make sense to have Spot 1 controlling 5-inch guns and the big guns. But you might actually be able to set it up. You wouldn't ever do that, but you might actually be able to set it up. Don't do that if you could. And there's an entire wall of these things, and I'd love to just go through and figure out more about this. I should zoom in on one of those to give you a better idea, but it's a multi-positional switch. So like if there are 4 different options, you can set it to one of 4 different options just by grabbing it and twisting it. It's really pretty cool. Okay. So Tom points out that older Manticoran ships had axial 1 and extra wide passageway down the center, usually, of the core hull. So in the Honorverse, that's how that works. Okay, so more pictures of the Wisconsin. On the left, you've got a little chart that's at the throttle station in one of the engine rooms. So you've got different engine rooms. You got 2 different engine rooms, one for each screw. And so this is one of the throttle things, and it's a little chart that tells you how many revolutions per minute will get you a given speed. And you'll note at the top, you get 1 knot with 6 revolutions per minute. When you get to the 31st knot, it takes 197 to get it. So it is not linear. It's kind of close. Maybe that is linear. It's not quite linear. So like 1 to 2, it goes from 6 to 11, not 12. 3 to 4 adds an extra 5 RPM. So it would be interesting to go down and sort of dissect that all the way through and see what those numbers look like. So like down at the bottom, I guess it's more linear than I first thought it was. Yeah, it's a little bit more linear than I first thought it was. So the thing on the right is actually a patch panel for power. So you've got these big cables, and I could have sworn I took a picture of one, but I couldn't find it. You've got these big loops of cable that have 3 lines. And the idea is you've got 3 different colors, and one plugs into A, one plugs into B, and one plugs into C. And then you can run that 50 feet to some other place to power something else. So if you've got a break in the line, you've got these little power things all over the ship. If you've taken damage and you've got a break in power, this is how damage control teams can go in and route power around breaks in the line. Let's see. Oh, Peter says 4 engine rooms, 4 shafts. I thought it was 2, but I stand corrected. I stand corrected. So 4 engine rooms, 4 shafts. So I said that there was sort of a mutual admiration society taking place between the docents and our tour group. Part of this was because Peter, as an engineer in the Merchant Marine, Peter not only was qualified on 600-pound steam, or is qualified on 600-pound steam plant, but this was one of the case studies that he did in college. So he knew the Iowa plant and was able to tell stuff to the docent that the docent didn't know. The docent was really, really good, but he wasn't a naval engineer, whereas Peter definitely is. We had a similar experience when we went aboard the USS Olympia for a BU-9 excursion, 2008, 2009, something that time frame. And we're down in the engine room, which is weird because the entire thing was covered with wood. They used wood as an insulating material, so it was a wood-paneled engine room. It was kind of like all the pipes had strips of wood with these brass bands sort of holding it in place. And so we're down there, and one of the non-engineer members of the group said, "What's that?" Pointed at something. The docent said, "We don't know what that is." At which point, Andy Presby and Brian Haven and I think Joel was there too. All the nukes who knew steam plants looked at each other and went, "Well, I know what that is," because it was a common steam plant feature, and they all knew exactly what it was because they had studied that. So that was kind of fun. Let's see. So this is an escape scuttle from the engineering spaces. So first of all, we're up top. We're looking down. There's a piece of plexiglass there covering that hole. And it's going down several different levels, down into the bowels of the ship. And if you're down in engineering and you need to get out, that's the ladder you take. When we got down there, I took this picture. I took it literally by taking my phone, holding it, sticking my arm in, and hitting the button, and I got a surprisingly good picture for doing that. I didn't even use the selfie camera, so I couldn't even see whether I had a good picture or not, because as a general rule on your cell phone, the selfie camera, the one pointing at you, is not as good a camera as the one on the backside. At least that's true with a bunch of cell phones. So I used the good camera to take that picture. So that's what it looks like from the other side. So imagine you're down there with 20 people or 5 people or however many people are down there, and you need to escape, and that's your way out. And that's not a very big hatch to get through at the top. I've had to go through hatches that size at sea, and it's bad enough when things are not chaotic to go through something like that. I can hardly imagine what it is when like the lights are out and there's smoke and all the other stuff. It would be pretty bad. Olive says Jeffrey's tube. Yeah, that's kind of what you're talking about there. Except in this case, there's no electronics or anything there. It's simply an egress point. Okay, so here's a list of some other naval museums, and I'm just tossing them out there. I've been to some, I haven't been to others, and this is certainly a non-comprehensive list. These are just the ones that I knew off the top of my head, and they got a few. These are kind of interesting in some ways. So first of all, there's the Albacore Museum in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. This is the Albacore submarine, which is a research submarine. They used it as a test bed. So it was the first one that had this sort of streamlined hull that modern nuclear submarines have. And they experimented with a rudder on the back of the sail to prevent what's known as snap roll. The sail acts as a rudder, so when you turn the ship, when you turn the submarine and the water presses against it, it wants to make it roll over. And they thought, let's put a rudder in the back of the sail to counteract that. The short version is, don't do that. That's a bad idea. It was such a bad idea. They got such vibration issues with it that they locked it in after like a week or so. They locked it in place and didn't test it anymore. But they did all sorts of other fancy control system mods, etc. And now it is a submarine that is totally and completely out of the water, so that you can see the entire hull in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And I've never made it up to see it, and I need to do that. Why is my watch talking to me? I don't know why my watch is talking to me. The USS Little Rock, Tom Pope and I saw this. We were going to a con in Rochester, and we decided to do a little side trip to Niagara Falls, and we're on the interstate heading to Niagara Falls in sort of rush hour traffic. And I look over at Tom and I say, "There's a Navy ship over there. Like that's like a World War II cruiser or something over there." And we could see the superstructure sticking out. It's the USS Little Rock, and it's on. There's also a World War II submarine there and a World War II destroyer, but we could only see the Little Rock. This is an interesting story. It's a Cleveland class light cruiser that post-war got guided missiles added to it, and then it became a Galveston class guided missile light cruiser. They took the Cleveland, they added some stuff to it, and they declared it to be a new class of ship, which was originally had the designation CLG, but that later became CG, because you may recall that the Navy sort of moved stuff around. I've talked previously about the 1975 reclassification, where frigates went from being bigger than destroyers to smaller than destroyers and stuff like that. So this is kind of interesting. I mean, this is exactly the sort of thing that we see in the movies, right? It's the Enterprise, right? But what do you call this thing? What's the classification of it now? What is it? And so we've heard Enterprise class, we've heard Constitution II class. There's a whole bunch of different ways that if this was something that the intelligence community, for instance, was talking about, there's a whole bunch of different ways that they could talk about that. For instance, you could call it like let's just invent a ship. We'll call it the Vincennes, the USS Vincennes. It is the 13th of the 12 Constitution class starships that we see in the original series. So you could call that Constitution class Hull 13. Okay. So then you refit it to the TMP standards. So what do you call it then? You could call it Constitution Hull 13, and you just know that it's been refit. You could call it Constitution 2 Hull whatever. Let's assume Enterprise was first and this one was second, so it'd be Constitution 2 Hull 2. You could call it, if it's significantly different from the previous ship, you could call it the Vincennes class. You could call it Modified Constitution. You could call it Modified Constitution 2 if it's significantly different from the other Constitution 2 classes. You can combine some of these. It could be Constitution 2 Mod 1, Constitution 2 Mod 2. This gets especially hairy when you run into some situations, which if you go back and you look at the Russian submarines, they made a lot of mods to a lot of different submarines. And so you ended up with a lot of things like Delta 4 Mod 2, things like that. You know, what happens if you take a class of submarines and every one of them is different in significant ways, and then you modify them to make them even more different? Or maybe they all start out the same and then you modify them. And what usually ends up happening in those situations is it takes a while for the intelligence community or whoever it is that's making these calls to decide. We saw this when the movie came out, and people are calling it, fans are calling it the Enterprise class and are calling it the Constitution 2 class, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't know if we ever got an official designation for it. But people start writing about it, and they come up with ideas about what they're going to call it. And sometimes those ideas don't get adopted. And so now you've got these documents that say something else. And so there's a little bit of sleuthing that has to take place to sort of keep this all separate, keep this all straight. And you need to sort of know the history of the ship to know exactly how you got there. And in some cases, like when we crank out ships, One Horse Shay says, is that when one introduces flights? It might be. When we crank out ships, we have a tendency to sort of crank them all out the same. There's little changes here and there, right? I mean, you go on board any of these ships, and there's definitely changes internally. But for the LA class submarines, the Los Angeles class, you've got flight ones, flight twos, and flight threes. And flight ones don't have missile tubes. Flight twos added missile tubes. Flight threes have the missile tubes, and they moved the sailplanes down to the bow to give them some under ice capability. Now, there's a long list of differences there, and those submarines have been modified over the years. They put new masts on, they put new sonar, towed array sonars on, they've got this, they've got that. There's lots of differences between individuals, but by and large, they fit in those big groups. Same with the BECK class. You've got the flight ones, flight twos, flight 2As. Note that the big difference between the BECKs is between the flight 2 and the flight 2A. Those are substantial differences. They added helicopter hangars on the back, and they did this and they did that. They moved this stuff around, etc. Those are clearly different big mods, but they just called it a 2A. And now you're got flight 3s coming out that look like 2As, but with some changes. So when you sort of add all this stuff up, it's interesting how all this happens. And in the case of the USS Little Rock, this is a historical example of it happening. And we saw a lot of this stuff in the post-war era because we built a really huge Navy for the war, and a lot of those ships hung around for a long time. We had a lot of cruisers that hung around. We had a lot of destroyers that hung around. The aircraft carriers had a tendency, some of them hung around, but they couldn't handle the larger, higher performance aircraft. So they had a tendency to sort of die out quickly. And on the cruiser side, we did build, there was a little bit of an effort to, like starting in the 60s, we had to start building new build cruisers because of the electronics and the missile systems involved. It was hard to retrofit. But for a while, that's what we did. Okay, next one is the USS Nautilus in Groton, Connecticut. I've been there. You can go all throughout the front end of the submarine. The aft end is still classified, so you can't go see the reactor or anything else like that. But you can see the control room and stuff like that. And there's I think that's all. There's a submarine museum there, but the Nautilus is the only ship that you can tour there. USS Olympia is an Olympia class protected cruiser, and it's the only one of her class. And she's in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And this was Dewey's flagship at the Battle of Manila Bay, and you can go all over it. And so it's worth taking a look at. USS Salem, I've never been to. It's a Des Moines class heavy cruiser, and it's not in Salem, Massachusetts. It's in Quincy, Massachusetts. And the Des Moines was really sort of the final expression of the all big gun cruiser design, the all gun cruiser design. It was a ship that was basically close to obsolete as she hit the water, but the Des Moines itself served as a flagship. I think the Salem also served as a flagship for a while, and they're big, impressive ships. Now, I haven't been on the Salem. I saw the Des Moines in the Philadelphia Navy Yard. She was in mothballs, awaiting being cut up in the razor blades, awaiting scrapping. But I did get a chance to sort of drive around Pierside and take a look at her, and she was a beautiful ship. She's a really beautiful ship. So Stephen Ross asked the question, is there a difference between flights and blocks? Not really. Flights was sort of I want to say that flights was a General Dynamics thing, because General Dynamics bought a shipyard and ended up as a submarine producer as a result. And they had been an airplane producer, and so they went with flights. And so I think I remember that there was a sort of a big deal at the time. It's like, what's this flight stuff? What's this flight stuff? So I don't think there's much difference there. Bob asked the question, did I tour the New Jersey? Yes, I did, only once. In fact, the docent yelled at me. I was with my buddy Arias Kaufman, We were standing at the back of the tour group, and Arias was a CNA employee at the time. I had gone off to the War College, and I was pointing something out to him, and I was trying to be very respectful. I didn't want to get in the docent's way, trying to be very quiet, because he's talking, and the docent was not happy that somebody was talking, and he said, excuse me, sir. If you'd like, you can take over the tour group. I said, my apologies. I'll be quiet. I was trying really hard to not get in the way of him. So it's not like I was being really boisterous or anything. I thought it was a little bit extreme response. So I was not happy about this, but we go and we climb in the turret. We're going around the ship. We go and we climb in the turret. And so there was a tour group of like 25 people, and 25 people will fit in the turret. It was a tight fit, but we all got in the turret. And if you've ever climbed in the turret from the outer deck, you have to go underneath the turret and up into it. And the space is, not super tall. And so it's not something that you do fast. It takes a while. And I was like the first guy. I was last in, so I was first out. And then the docent came out. And so the docent's standing there as people are coming out of the turret. And it takes a couple of minutes for everybody to get out. And so I get out and I sort of walk over, and Arias and I are sort of talking over, and I'm pointing out like the Slick 32 system and some other things there. And Walter Hunt is talking with the docent, and just making conversation as we're waiting for everybody else to come out. And the docent says, well, what do you do for a living? And Walter says, well, I'm a science fiction writer. And my buddy Arias over there, he works for the Center for Naval Analysis. And Chris is a professor at the Naval War College. So the docent broke the sound barrier, zooming over to me. Oh, I'm sorry, sir. I had no idea. Would you like to take over the tour? No. I said, no, really, you know more about this ship than I do, which is true. I mean, he's the guy who's been there. He's gone through whatever classes they do, etc. I know a lot about this ship, but I wasn't qualified to be a docent for it. And I didn't want to disturb him. But see, the thing is, one of the reasons why we were there was so that we could have those little side conversations. And I said, I apologize for what happened earlier. I wasn't trying to get in your way. I was just pointing out a piece of gear to Arias here, because that's a modern piece of gear. And I was pointing out what was modern, what isn't. And if you're okay with it, sir, when we go through stuff, if I ask, can you just give me 20 seconds or so at the end to point out stuff to Walter? Because Walter's a science fiction writer. And one of the reasons why he's here is to see a battleship and to sort of think about ships in general. So if there's things that I can point out that he can maybe use in his stories, I'd appreciate it if you'd let me do that. And he said, sure, no problem. So like when we were in the Combat Engagement Center, I made a special point of pointing out how the phones work, how the radio telephones work. I've got a picture of one here. At some point, I'll put it in a presentation. But you've got like a little selector that selects channels. And so the channels are you're not like adjusting the antenna. It's more like a TV channel, right? It's more like a cable channel, right? You've got certain channels that are running through the wires, and you're just using the selector to get to that particular antenna, that particular circuit. You're not actually changing the wiring or anything like that. You're not tuning in on something. You're just flipping over to the channel where that information is being broadcast. And it's a push-to-talk system, and there's some other funkiness about it. And it's one of those things that it's the sort of thing that you can add some realism if you get that stuff right. So I pointed that stuff out to Walter, and we had a great tour. But that tour was 2007, maybe. It's 2008. That time frame. We had just finished the PhilCon science fiction convention, and I haven't been to PhilCon in a long time. So I have no idea what the current status of that tour is, what it looks like originally. Okay. One Horse Shape points out there's a sign of the Enterprise being called the Enterprise class in Star Trek 2. Yeah, there's an Enterprise. It says something about like basically Enterprise class simulator or something. And I know that some people have said, yeah, maybe it's not like Enterprise class as in warship class, but Enterprise class as in like Enterprise classroom. I don't know. The thing is, if anything is apparent from a couple of weeks ago when we did all the We Travel by Night videos, especially that torpedo room video, they don't always think through their signage, and they certainly don't move their signage around, and they're not worried. Consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, and they are not letting that hobgoblin anywhere near them when it comes to stuff like that. So there's also Satetian ops that shows up in at least some of the tech manual stuff, and you've also got like that big area in one of the next gen movies, the big astronomical navigation area. I forget exactly what they called it. Where'd that come from? You never see that anyplace else, and it's not clear where that is or anything. So they're not consistent about this stuff. So I take everything like that with a grain of salt. Okay, let's see if there's anything else that I want to. Bob says he recommends the USS Constitution tour in Boston. I never made it to the Constitution during my 5 years in Newport. I just never made it there, and I feel bad about that. Peter Gold points out that DD in Buffalo is the Sullivans, and then it's the one that sank at the dock a couple of years ago. I had totally forgotten about it sinking at the dock. Yeah, that's not good when your museum ship sinks at the dock. So Stephen Ross asked a question that Tom Pope answered when going back and talking about that slide with those controls there. He asked, is this like shunting power around? Is this how circuit breaker shunting power around? And Tom replies that this wasn't about power. This is about inputs. So it's about control circuitry, not power circuitry. It's about, it's about your Ethernet connection, not about your power cord. That's a bad analogy, but you know what I mean. It's about which piece of control gear controls which gear. So which director controls which turret, which gunnery computer is sending information to which director. It's about how you've got a distributed system where the control functions for the guns and the guns themselves are spread throughout the ship. And how do I ensure that spot one is using the information from gunnery plot one to control turret one? And that's, you line up the things so that happens. Now, this has some interesting implications that I haven't thought through. One of which is, okay, so your ship is maneuvering, and now spot one can't see the target very well, but spot two aft can. Or maybe you're in a situation where early on spot one doesn't have control of the aft guns because your T's being crossed, but now you've turned broadside, and now spot one can control all the guns. That means that there's somebody making a radio call or a call on the intercom down saying, I need you to reconfigure this. Turn the switches so that the right controller has control of the right stuff. So this is one of those things that, like, you never see anything like this in Star Trek, right? Because the computer just does it. You don't have to make those changes. The computer just knows. And I've been saying for years now that I think that the Enterprise does not have crew in the sense that the U.S. Navy would have crew. The Enterprise has officers, and the most of the crew functions, something like the crew functions of a battleship, are served by the ship's computer. There's such a high degree of automation here that a lot of things that we would throw people at, because if you look at this number here, if you look at complement, 2,700 people for World War II in Korea and 1,800 people for the Gulf War. So the difference between 2,700 and 1,800 is largely anti-aircraft batteries, right? When you had lots of little anti-aircraft guns and you had all the 5-inch turrets manned, you needed a lot of crew, and you could get rid of about 900 people if you just didn't man all the little guns and man all the 5-inch gun turrets. In fact, I think they pulled some of those turrets off, because I think some of those turrets actually, when they put the Tomahawk missile launchers in, they had to build up the deck. They built new decks. And in some places they pulled stuff out of there. And I think in a couple of places they pulled 5-inch 38 gun mounts out, those smaller turrets out, so that they could then build a deck and put Tomahawk missiles on top of it. So when you pull that stuff out, you don't need that crew. And you don't need the crew down below in the gunnery feed mechanisms. In fact, I should have included that. In the Massachusetts, you can go into the room that feeds those 5-inch 38s. It's a central magazine, and it's got chutes going off in all directions. And so you've got like one group of guys that's feeding multiple gun turrets. So, if you get rid of like four, the 4 turrets, if you're not using the 4 turrets that those guys feed, then you don't need the guys down below either. And so that's how you cut 900 people off your crew. Even then, 1,800 people, oh my God, that's a huge ship. That's second only to the aircraft carriers and the amphibs in terms of the amount of crew you need. And in that case, it's a steam plant during a time period when steam plants are dying out. And it's a very quirky steam plant. So that was one of the issues, is that it wasn't just that it was a number of guys. It's that it was guys that were in short supply. And then you had to like teach your gunnery guys to fire the 16-inch guns. So this wasn't an off-the-shelf skill set that they needed here. And you're likely to see that in any sort of science fiction thing where you do that. Every now and then you'll get a story. There seems to be a minor subgenre of military science fiction about the old ship that's just about to be decommissioned, but somehow saves the day. And sometimes they'll get into the fact that, it requires special skill sets that nobody else in the fleet has anymore. Every now and then you see a little bit of that, at least. Okay, so stellar cartography was the thing I was trying to think of. That big room that you see in the movie. Jens points out that the Sacramento had the Kentucky's power plant, and that reminds me, I forgot to include a very, very important thing about the Wisconsin, which is that she was nicknamed the Whiskey. And the reason why she was nicknamed the Whiskey is because she had a collision that badly damaged her bow, and they concluded that the easiest way to fix the ship was to cut the bow off and go to the partially completed USS Kentucky, which they had suspended construction on, and cut the bow off of the Kentucky and put the Kentucky's bow on the Wisconsin. And so she got the nickname Whiskey as a result of that. The Sacramento had the Kentucky's power plant, but I think there was four turbines, and I believe that the Sacramento and her sister ship had 2 turbines each. And so when they built those oilers, they actually were able to salvage the plant and give it to 2 different ships. That is in Wildenberg's Gray Hulls and Gray Steel and Black Oil, I think is the name of the book, and it's about the development of underway replenishment. It's a pretty decent book. It's got a few issues. Let's just say that the editor could have done a better job. The editor could have done a better job. Yeah, Jens refers to it as the Wistucky. I think it's considered that the way that's supposed to work is the bow is the front of the name, and so it wouldn't have been the Wisconsin. It would have been the Kenconsin, which of course just doesn't work. When the San Francisco ran into an undersea mountain, they cut the front end of the Honolulu off, which had been recently decommissioned. The San Francisco had relatively recently had a refueling. So they had just spent a bunch of money to refurb that reactor, and she was expected to be in service for a while. And the Honolulu was sort of old and tired, or at least her reactor was old and tired, and they elected not to refuel her. And so they had this recently decommissioned submarine with a perfectly good front end that they could cut off and put onto the San Francisco. And so there was some discussion about whether she would be the San Fran Lulu or the Hana Frisco. And I think I remember everybody basically concluding San Fran Lulu sounded better, but Hana Frisco is the way that technically they should do it. If you can use the word technically, there's a right way to do a nickname in this situation. So, okay. All right, I'm looking here. See if there's anything else. I think that there isn't anything else. So I'm going to go out on a limb and say that Alec is not going to join us tonight, which means I will have to go back in and change the name of the show and the description of the show. But I will do that after the fact, probably sometime tomorrow. But in the meantime, I think it is time to declare victory and let you all go. And I'm going to go to sleep as well. But as I said early on, I will indeed plan on being here next week and for the next couple of weeks. And you may even get a new vista behind me because I'm thinking about taking my laptop and moving it over here. So previously, when I first started the show, I was over here facing that way. Now I'm talking about being over here facing that way. So eventually, if the show lasts long enough, I will do a complete 360-degree rotation, and you guys will get to see my entire living room and dining room setup. But that is something for another night. In the meantime, thank you very much, everybody. I appreciate the fact that you come and you spend your Saturday night here. And I love doing the show, and I plan on keep on doing the show. So until next week, see you later.